in the late 20s and early 30s, at the time which the story of the Tigers happened, Green Bay, New York, the Bears, and the Cardinals were the only teams that still exist today that were in the NFL. And it was a total hand-to-mouth operation. I mean, it was an exciting sport and it was starting to grow, but all of it was loosely organized. Why the Tigers were all but forgotten is an interesting question, as you put forth. And I've wondered about that. But they were almost forgotten, and yet they were so very good. They were the best professional team in the country in 1929.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hello, friends. It's Tim Hanlon. How are you? It's Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. As the announcer has said, and as I've confirmed, that is the place you are at. Thank you for joining us. If it's your first time, we welcome you into the fold. If you've been here before, hopefully we do not scare you away in your return visit. Today, we're going to go back into pro football, and we're going to do something a little different here. We don't normally focus on teams or leagues that were not, quote unquote, truly professional. But this was an interesting story that caught my eye, and I thought was worthwhile because it does have very strong elements into, in this case, the early days of professional football, the NFL, in its very sort of ragtag and scruffy days in the 1920s and 1930s. The topic we're going to be focused on today is a team called the Memphis Tigers. And no, that's not the University of Memphis Tigers that we know today. But as you will find out in this conversation, it kind of is. And we'll let the conversation sort of lead you as to why the two are related. But the Tigers of Memphis, the Memphis Tigers, were a professional football team in the late 20s and early 1930s, the height of the Depression. Of course, economically, but were part of a relatively ragtag world of professional football at that time, with a fledgling, and that's being frankly quite charitable, North American NFL, too much soccer on the mind, NFL, National Football League, but also a lot of independent teams and other attempts and tries to potentially challenge the NFL, which was clearly not nearly as the dominant force as it is today. The Memphis Tigers is our focus. The pre-NFL Memphis Tigers, they never actually did play in the NFL, but the history of the NFL is absolutely tied up in this interesting story. Our guest today is Wylie McLallen, and the book he has written is called Tigers by the River, a true and accurate tale of the early years of professional football. I found this conversation really intriguing, and the book as well. And if you call yourself an early pro football fan, I really recommend this book as a good fodder for your enjoyment and to solidify your knowledge of the early days of the NFL and beyond. Before we get there, we want to quickly remind you that our show is, as often, is sponsored by our friends at Audible, where you can get an audiobook for free, right? An audiobook for free, a free download for your choosing from over 180,000 titles. And if you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats, that is the place where you can get your free trial. You get 30 days of the Audible service. You get a free audiobook download. You can cancel at any time. And you will also be benefiting the show just a little bit by doing so. If you don't enjoy audiobooks now on your device, you are missing out. There's some amazing, well-read stories, both of fiction and nonfiction, you name the topic. And there are over 180,000 titles and counting that Audible has within its nest of intrigue that you can choose from. So why not give Audible a trial? And why not get your free audiobook download to see what I'm talking about? That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free audiobook download and trial of the Audible service. Thank you, Audible, again, for your sponsorship of the show. We appreciate it, and we appreciate you listening, of course. And now let us waste little time, no more time, into our conversation, which will begin now with Wylie McLallen, the topic being the Tigers by the River, the story of the Memphis Tigers of the early days of professional football here on the Big Podcast. So let me just get some, some prelude. So I'm really curious as to, before we get into the story of the Tigers in Memphis and the origins, of what is now known as today's professional NFL football. How did you come across the topic and passionate enough to commit some time and effort to writing a nice tome about those early days in Memphis?
Well, I was born in Memphis, but I spent my boyhood in Indianapolis. My father had a business, and he loved the Chicago Bears. And so I loved the Chicago Bears too. And I was really a fanatic, a young sports fanatic, loved all sports, and especially the Chicago Bears. And I was glued to the TV on their games. And when they won the National Football League title in 1963, we were at the game against the New York Giants in Wrigley Field. And it was a very exciting event. And Daddy told me that one of the best professional football teams in history were the Memphis Tigers. He said they beat the Bears and they beat the Green Bay Packers. And they had Hall of Fame players on their roster. And I didn't disbelieve him, but I was skeptical about it. And years later, when I began to write fiction, I had the idea. I started writing a novel about a young man in Memphis who becomes heartbroken when the quarterback of the NFL team in Memphis, a fictional team, is so severely injured that his career in football is ended. And I wanted some more background information, and I began to, I remember my father telling me about this team that was in Memphis in the late 20s and early 30s, and I went to the library, and there wasn't anything there. There was nothing about them there. The archivist, John Harkins, who taught me high school history, did some research, and he came back with a small article in one of the newspapers that had been one of the newspapers about Zach Curlin naming the University of Memphis athletic teams after this team, after this old professional team. And that made me even more curious. And so I just went back into the microfilm of the old newspapers and dug the whole story out.
Well, that's a couple of things. So one, you sort of glossed over your father's business. So do you want there's a little interesting story there as to what that business was, right?
Well, it was the Howard Johnson Motor Lodge and Restaurant. My grandfather owned a motel in Memphis. He owned motels in Memphis and Nashville. And he got into, Howard Johnson was looking, this was in the very early 50s. Howard Johnson was looking to get into the motel business. And he and my grandfather somehow connected. And so Grandpa sold the motels in Memphis and in Nashville. And they did a study. Howard Johnson wanted to make sure that the first motel he built was going to be successful. And they did a study for sites, and they picked Indianapolis because it was a very vibrant town with every kind of economy. You know, they had manufacturing, agriculture, and distribution, and it was a busy crossroads. And so they built this in 1954. And of course, my grandfather needed my father. They were in business together, and so we moved to Indianapolis. But I think that my father's original love of the Chicago Bears came from when they played this old team in Memphis. Because he said every time the Chicago Bears came to town, he was at those games.
So as you delved into the story, right, so it probably my assumption is that one of the reasons why it was relatively hard to immediately find information, and again, of course, this is in the days way before the internet even existed, right? So my sense is that part of the problem was the fact that the Tigers of Memphis weren't officially, or even even in back then, defined as a member of either the NFL or the what was regarded as the largest or most prominent professional football league in the country, right? Because of its relative haphazard and regional kind of dynamic back then, right?
Well, what you have to understand, Tim, is at that time, all of professional football, it was a fledgling sport. It was just emerging. It wasn't. The National Football League first came together in 1920, and even then, it took years before the organization became firm. And of that original meeting in 1920, only two teams, the Chicago Bears and the Chicago Cardinals, still exist today. Green Bay didn't come into it until about 1923, and then the New York Giants didn't come into it until about 1925. And in the late 20s and early 30s, at the time which the story of the Tigers happened, Green Bay, New York, the Bears, and the Cardinals were the only teams that still exist today that were in the NFL. And it was a total hand-to-mouth operation. I mean, they really weren't. It was an exciting sport, and it was starting to grow. But all of it was loosely organized. Why the Tigers were all but forgotten is an interesting question, as you put forth. And I've wondered about that. But they were almost forgotten, and yet they were so very good. They were the best professional team in the country in 1929.
Well, so let's get into that story a little bit, and I guess maybe a basis of that is that one of the reasons you could claim that, right, is because these NFL teams, despite being in whatever definition of the league was at that time, were also
it was a fledgling league.
Fledgling, right? So, but they were also they were taking on teams from other sources, right? Either regional leagues or other sort of independents, I guess, right? And that's I guess where Memphis sort of comes into the crosshairs of some of these teams you're mentioning, right?
Yes. Well, Memphis was, they were owned in 1929. They were owned by one of the wealthiest men in the South, a man named Clarence Saunders, and he was the founder of the Piggly Wiggly grocery chain. And he was able to offer the best contracts available to the best players. And when they would play a team, if one of the players on the opposite team was very good, he'd offer him a contract, and that player would jump to the Memphis Tigers. And this happened too when they played Green Bay. They played Green Bay late in the season. Green Bay was the undefeated champions of the National Football League that year, and they beat them very soundly. They played them it was after the NFL season was officially over. And two of the players on that NFL team, Cal Hubbard and John Blood McNally, were offered contracts to play for the Tigers by Clarence Saunders, and they jumped to his team. And the next week they played and beat the Chicago Bears. Contracts weren't so firm back then like they are now. And if you offered a good player enough money, and back then enough money was just a few $100s, they'd jump.
So the NFL, in its embryonic state, right, was still not necessarily guaranteed to be the best, quote unquote, place to play if you were a good player, right? There were plenty of other independent and other teams out there that could offer either on a per diem or on a shorter term or even more competitive contract to kind of jump, and it was kind of almost de rigueur at that point, right? Versus it being heresy.
I think that's a pretty good assessment, Tim. I believe you're right. It's very interesting. Like in 1920, when the league was first organized, and it wasn't called the National Football League, It was called, the first name they gave it was, the first name they gave it was, I can't quite remember, but it didn't take the name National Football League until about 2 years later. And the fellow who was sort of in charge decided that each team, in order to be a member of the league, should pay $1,000, and none of that money was ever collected. They were just trying to do that to give it some kind of credibility. And the first person who was named president of that league was Jim Thorpe, not because he was a good administrator, but because he was one of the most famous athletes of that day. And again, it was an attempt to give it some credibility.
Sure.
But the reason they organized it was so that the teams could have some regular schedules. The problem with being an independent team, it was hard to stick to a schedule because so many teams would appear and then they'd disappear because they didn't have enough money to go on. And that was a problem in the early years of the NFL too. A lot of the teams that were there in 1920, well, as I said, all of the teams in 1920, only two exist to this day. The Cardinals and the Bears. And money was a big problem back then. And on the other hand, in college football was enormously popular. You would have 50,000 people at some of the big stadiums on college campuses throughout the country on every Saturday throughout the season. And one of the reasons why professional football began to grow is because the great college players, people remained curious about them after they finished college. And if a professional team could sign a famous college player, that would increase their gate.
So why would a guy like Clarence Saunders, with a successful grocery enterprise, why would he even be remotely interested in putting money into a team in a sport that was so relatively chaotic on a professional level in 1928-29?
That's a good question. Well, initially he did it because his son, Lee Saunders, who had played collegiately at the University of Swanee, wanted to play some professional football. And I think that Clarence, Mr. Saunders, I think he was kind of an indulgent parent. He had 3 children. And so he knew about this professional team that was playing in Memphis from his son, and they were run by a sports writer named Wylie McLallen, and he conferred with Maxwell and took over the team. And he didn't do much with them in 1928, except attend a few games and make sure that his son got to play. But in 1929, the second year, he became very enthusiastic about them, and he had tremendous plans for his team. And he had enough money. He was a very wealthy man, like he was one of the wealthiest men in the South, so it didn't bother him to lose money at first. But unfortunately, the Great Depression happened. The markets crashed in the fall of 1929, and within a year, Clarence Saunders was broke and his company had to declare bankruptcy. But the Memphis Tigers kept on because they were so good, and they did attract crowds into the stadium where they played, and it was a small stadium by our standards now. It only held about 10,000 people. But in 1930, a group of businessmen in Memphis banded together and formed the Memphis Tigers Association. And they each put in $300 apiece. I think there was about 35 of them that did this, and that was seed money to keep the team going. And they had even better players on their roster than they did in the year before, 1929, when they were so very good. But they didn't really have the leadership that had been provided by Clarence Saunders. And so they didn't win as many games, but they were a very good team. And throughout their existence, and their final game was in the fall of 1935, they were an excellent professional football team.
Well, some of the excellence was on display. You mentioned in 1929, and again, we're talking about a team that was effectively operating as an independent. If I'm not mistaken, according to my research here, I think the Tigers actually played only one game away in 1929, and all the other games were home enterprises, right?
Yes, I think you're right. And the game away, I think, was in Nashville. They play this car dealer team in Nashville called the O'Gennies, and that was the only game they had away. See, back then, to travel on the road, I mean, like a professional football, when they had a professional football game, if the weather was good, maybe 5,000 to 10,000 people came out to see it. And this was true even in the big cities, in Chicago and in Cleveland, and Green Bay was not a big town. And to travel, you had to meet the travel expenses, and maybe you got to have part of the gate. But if you played at home, you didn't have the travel expenses, and your part of the gate was gross profit. So it was more feasible to play your games at home. That seems astounding when you look at it today with all the money that is in major professional sports. But back then, the resources were scant, and it was just beginning to emerge. And there just wasn't nearly as much money then as there is now, like you have today.
Yeah, it almost feels like a sort of a barnstorming type of element, similar to what you would have experienced, say, with the Negro Leagues in baseball and some of the other sort of minor baseball teams out at that time of that era.
Yeah,
basketball
that's right.
too. Yeah. So I guess the point I was sort of trying to bring out there is that as you're talking about the team in 1930 that was essentially reconstituted, or at least new ownership, right? You're coming off of a wave of success. I mean, they played the Bears, the NFL Chicago Bears, twice in 29, losing the first time, but winning the second time, as well as beating the Green Bay Packers relatively handily. So clearly, even though it's an independent, one-off type of game per se, and I guess you could question whether the NFL teams, quote unquote, took it seriously or did take it seriously, and it truly was, But in terms of Memphis's, season and performance, those are two major feathers in their cap, right? And it almost seems that, at least on the field, 1930 would be even bigger and better and, perhaps even more, quote unquote, professional going forward. No?
Well, I think they had better players than a 1930 team. But the difference was, if you look at it closely, was leadership and management. Clarence Saunders provided dynamic leadership both on and off the field to his football team. And when he left, they gave the coaching duties to a very good player named Larry Betancourt. And Larry Betancourt was one of the best linemen of that era. After, later he played with the Green Bay Packers for 3 years. And Betancourt was a very good player, but he was a lousy coach. And also it just didn't work out so well. So they began to lose some games. They won most of their games in 1930, but they lost about 4 or 5 games, which the team in 1929, they only lost once. And the team in 1929 kept getting better, whereas the team in 1930 started off very good. They beat a very good NFL team, the Portsmouth Spartans. And after that, they started going downhill. They made a trip up to Chicago and played the Chicago Cardinals with Ernie Nevers in Comiskey Stadium. And they were given a good guarantee. So they made a little money on that trip, but the Cardinals beat them very badly. And they just, on the field, they weren't as good. The following year, they rebounded on the field. They were under the leadership of Early Maxwell. And they didn't have as strong a roster as they had in 1930. But they won their first 8 games, and they won them impressively. And then they played some NFL teams. I think they played the Brooklyn Dodgers, which was an NFL team back then. They got beat, but they put up a good fight, and they played another NFL team. I can't remember exactly which one it was, and they were beaten again. I think it might have been the Cardinals. and they were beaten again, but they put up good fights in both those teams, and they were considered to be the best independent professional football team in America in 1931.
See, so that's interesting, right? So the fact that they were being accorded, and look, I think another thing which we really haven't touched on yet is that the NFL, as well as professional football more broadly, to the extent that, other teams aside from the NFL were part of that mixture, was largely still a Northeastern and or Midwestern kind of scenario. And you're talking now about a team in Memphis, right, which was one of a small handful or smaller handful of teams that were outside of that geography in the United States.
Yes. Yes, it was. The professional football really grew in the big cities of the Midwest and the Northeast. They had the population, and they had the manufacturing, the wealth to support professional sports. Keep in mind, baseball, in the 1920s was as popular, even more popular than college football. But, like even with professional baseball, like the National League and the American League, which was already, they were well organized, and it was, they were a mature professional sport. There weren't many teams outside of the Midwest and the Northeast. There weren't any Major League professional baseball teams in the South, and they had yet to get out to the West Coast. It was all in the Midwest and in the Northeast where the population and the manufacturing and the wealth was. They had, because of their manufacturing, they had a more seasoned, larger, better organized labor force, and these people had better paychecks than their counterparts in the South, and they could afford to buy a ticket to a professional baseball game or a professional football game on the weekends. And at this time, in the early 30s, you began to see a slow growth of professional football. And in the book, I brought out some of these things. Like in 1930, the football they played with it wasn't yet tapered for the pass. It was still kind of fat, and you could do drop kicking. But at a meeting in 1934 or 30, I think it was in the summer of 34, the NFL, which was becoming stronger and becoming better organized, they started changing rules, like they tapered the ball to the form that it is now. And it eliminated drop kicking forever. You couldn't drop kick. You can't really drop kick the modern football like you could the one before it. But they did that so that the passing game could come more into play, because passing was exciting. Offense was exciting. And they also moved the goalpost. They moved the goalpost up to the goal line. And there's been a few changes to that since then. But they moved the goalpost up the goal line so that there could be more field goals, which was done by place kicking. And they also shortened they moved where the line of play was. It used to be that, where the person was tackled, that's where the next play would start, and that was kind of awkward. So they moved the yardstick more to the middle of the field. Like if some guy got tackled at the sidelines, the play would start near the center of the field. They wouldn't start it at that sideline. It seems odd, but that's how it was back then. And there were many changes. The sport matured.
From what you can tell in your research, though, as these games were being played, and obviously as an independent yet dominant and well-regarded independent team, was there any evidence of having to, negotiate the rules, or potentially some of those rules that weren't necessarily fully formed, or was it always sort of the NFL rules, I guess, as the demarcation of how the game would be played, or was there real conjecture and maybe variance?
No, they pretty much went by the NFL rules, because some of these independent teams wanted to be in the NFL. That was their goal, and some of them made it. Like there was a team in St. Louis called the Gunners, and they made it into the NFL, but they only lasted about a year. The Tigers were offered a franchise in the NFL at the end of 1930, but there just wasn't enough money in professional football to interest the owners into taking that franchise. They didn't want to pay $5,000 to enter the league and then go through another money-losing season like they had in 1930. And that was endemic throughout the professional game. I think the Chicago Bears, they were probably one of the first teams to start making money regularly. But for a long time with them, it was hand to mouth. And when the league was first formed, George Halas sold cars, and his partner, Sterneman, he worked in a filling station. They had part-time jobs in addition to owning and running and playing professional football. And Curly Lambeau, who was the coach of the Green Bay Packers, sold men's clothing. It was a hand-to-mouth operation for almost the first 15 years. Then, as the league became more firm and they put out better rules, and they began to not only require, if you wanted to enter the league, you had to pay a fee, and if you didn't pay the fee, then they weren't going to let you in. As it grew, some of the teams started making some money, but it was really, really hand to mouth. I mean, the growth was slow. It started to become steady because it was an exciting sport, but it was very slow.
So in the early 30s, as the Tigers continued to kind of make their way through year to year with sort of, I don't call it wobbly finances, but certainly wasn't the epitome of stability, right? Give us a sense of, getting into like 32 and 33. I mean, it seems like I'm wondering, given that opportunity back a number of years earlier in 1930 that you're mentioning to go to the NFL, I'm wondering that if the owners, depending on the year, saw a maybe path to a second chance to eventually get to the NFL as that firmness was starting to happen in that league.
Looking back on it, the opportunity that was offered to them in 1930, they didn't see it as the great opportunity that the NFL became in the 50s and 60s. Only the very passionate men like George Halas, Tim Mara, Curly Lambeau, only those very passionate men, and later George Preston Marshall, believed in the future of professional football. And they staked their entire lives upon it. But most people, professional football wasn't that big a deal at all. They had other things on their mind. And Clarence Saunders, he became passionate about it. But then he went broke, and he couldn't do any more with it. And some of the men who, like Early Maxwell, was passionate about it, but it was not a money-making proposition. As good a team as he was able to put on the field, he didn't get enough gate. He paid all the bills, and everyone got paid what their contract stated. But he didn't come out of there with enough money to keep him interested in having another team the next year. It was a really hard go in those years. And if you go to I got this book right in front of me. If we go to 1930, and I'll give you a list of the teams that were in the NFL. Okay? All right, 1932, there were 8 teams in the NFL. Chicago Bears, Green Bay Packers, Portsmouth Spartans, Boston Braves, New York Giants, Brooklyn Dodgers, Chicago Cardinals, and Stapleton. And of those 8, only 4 are still in the league. The Bears, Green Bay, Giants, and the Chicago Cardinals. The Chicago Cardinals are the Arizona Cardinals now. That's what we're looking at, In 1930, there were 11 teams in the NFL. Green Bay, New York Giants, Chicago Bears, Brooklyn Dodgers, Providence Steamrollers, Stapleton, Chicago Cardinals, Portsmouth Spartans, Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, Minneapolis, and Newark. And then on the next year, 1931, they dropped back down to 10. That's what it was like back then, Tim. Teams faded. Most teams did not make money. And I mean, when I say most teams, I mean maybe one or two teams were making money. The rest were not, and they couldn't support themselves.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. Yeah, it would seem, though, right? Assuming the team in Memphis on the field was stable and was still a draw and was still a potentially viable enterprise, assuming the right finances behind it. You described those teams in the NFL, and maybe the vision wasn't there. Maybe the economy, certainly with the Depression, couldn't support it. But I guess you look at it down, through the lens of history. You see, at least I do, is geography, right? And in this case, Memphis being a bit of an expansion, shall we say, geographically. And again, maybe this is too early for people to see, given the day-to-day realities of, Depression economy United States, right? But, given that sort of level of strength in that sort of Northeast Midwestern corridor, you'd think that a team that's relatively stable, at least on the field, a competitive and arguably well-regarded independent team would be something of an asset to be coveted perhaps by some of those NFL owners of vision, but maybe it just wasn't there yet.
I think that's exactly right. I think that you have it right there. Exactly. George Halas, who was really, the real leaders back then were George Halas and Tim Mara and George Preston Marshall. There were others, but those three were the most prominent. George Preston Marshall owned he owned the Boston Braves. And they weren't doing well in Boston. The Memphis Tigers played the Boston Braves twice to scoreless ties. This was in 1932. And they had good players on that team, very good players. Some of them are in the Hall of Fame, but they weren't doing well. And George Preston Marshall owned a chain of laundries. I think it was in Washington, D.C. So he moved them from Boston, and I think it was about 1930, in the mid-30s sometime, and he renamed them the Redskins. And he was passionate about that sport and about his team. And, of course, we know what happened with the Washington Redskins. And Tim Mara, who owned the New York Giants, he was passionate about it. And, of course, George Halas. And these men were always looking to improve the game. They were always looking for opportunity. And, I think the South was just not ready. Outside of, the Northeast Midwest corridor, the rest of the country was just not quite ready to expand for the expansion of professional sports in general.
Well, yeah, so that's fair enough. So let's maybe get to 1933, because in my mind it seems like this is a bit of a pivotal year and or consideration, because S.A. Goodman had come back, I guess, as sort of the owner or the sole owner of the team at that point. But it almost seems like the thought was maybe this could indeed be a professional league-bound opportunity again, but not maybe necessarily with the NFL, but through some other mechanisms by which to compete at a similar level as the NFL. Do you want to maybe get into some of the seeds of that and how Memphis perhaps was going to be professional in a pro circuit?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Professional football, like as we've been talking about, it was growing ever so slowly, but it was growing. And the National Football League was starting to get some legs, even though most of the teams that were playing then, were not going to be playing, later. But they were starting to get some legs, and people were starting to go to professional football games every week. And people like S.A. Godman, there were other professional teams in the South too, and they were independent. He looked up and he saw how, that this was happening. And it was happening with the National Football League because they could provide schedules and stability. So his idea and other people's idea was to form a league in the South. And they did that the next year. It was called the American Football League. And they had teams in Dallas, Memphis. They had one in Oklahoma. They had one in Charlotte, North Carolina. They had one started off in Kansas City, and then they moved to St. Louis. And they had one in Louisville, too. I think there were originally 8 teams, and then that fell down to 6 at the start of the season. And they were able to provide regular schedules at the start of the season. See, when when an independent team started off each season, they didn't really have a set schedule. They had to take games as they came along.
Right.
But the American Football League gave every team in that league a set schedule. The crowds were bigger, but again, they weren't big enough. And George Halas was delighted with this attempt, and he thought that it was going to be a great success. I don't know if he really thought it was, but he gave word in newspapers that, look to the South, they're going to have a great success with professional football, because he saw the success of professional football in the South as the success of professional football as a whole. And he could keep on, and his teams and his gate could keep on growing.
Well, okay, so let's stop there for a second. So that seems a little odd, maybe in again, through the retrospective of time. Why would a George Halas with an NFL, and again, maybe because it's still early and formative, it seems a little odd, at least in that framework, that he would actually think that would be a good thing versus, say, being a competitive thing.
Well, Halas was a warrior, all right. And there had been a league, like when he signed Red Grange in 1925. Red Grange had an agent named Cash and Carey Powell. And when Halas wouldn't meet the contract that Cash and Carey Powell wanted after he'd first signed him, after they'd played a few games, Cash and Carey Powell took Red Grange, and he formed his own league around Red Grange, and they lasted about a year. But when Godman and these others formed the American Football League in the South, they made it clear to the NFL that they weren't in competition. They were not going to go. They weren't playing in the Midwest and in the Northeast cities. They were playing in the Southern cities. And they made that clear. And I think that Halas was for the growth of professional football. He saw the growth of professional football meant the growth of the Chicago Bears and the National Football League. And maybe he saw, he was a visionary kind of person. And he saw that if professional football succeeded in the South, and it had a better chance of succeeding with the league, then maybe down the years they could arrange something.
Yeah,
go ahead, Tim.
I'm sorry, but not to the point though of financial support or any of that.
No, he didn't do that.
Yeah.
No, he didn't. He didn't do that. He didn't give them any financial support. But he thought it was a great opportunity for football in the South.
So it seems like S.A. Goodman then became pretty much the flame carrier for this, because obviously Memphis, the Tigers were, essentially I don't know, were they the strongest independent team in the South at that point? It seemed like there were at least a few others that were kind of getting some similar credibility, right?
They were probably the strongest. They had the best players, but everything changed from year to year so much. I mean, like Bucky Moore, who was their great halfback, and Bucky Moore was one of the best running backs in the nation at that time. Bucky Moore played for them in 29 and in 30. In 1934, when they formed the American League, he was playing and coaching for the Louisville team. I think they were called the Louisville Bourbons. Bucky Moore was playing for the opponent. And Larry Betancourt, who was also a baseball player, he no longer played with them. He quit playing for them after the 30 season, and he went up and he was playing for Green Bay. And players jumped around a lot. It was rosters changed so much from year to year. And I think this was even true with a lot of the NFL teams. One thing that back then that they didn't want to do is they didn't want to recruit college players, because they didn't want to stir any kind of trouble, with the National Collegiate Athletic Association. They wanted to remain free of any controversy in that regard. And the NFL had a policy back then of hands off all football players and then playing collegiately. And so the American Football League took that same policy.
I'm sorry. I think it's important also to just throw a quick qualifier here, right? So as people yell at their devices as they're listening to this intently, the American Football League is an appellation that it's been numerous in pro football history, right? So
you're right.
Just put it in context. 1926 was the first major recognition of an entity called the American Football League, and then this was really, I guess, the second entity to take that name. But arguably, in retrospect and history, it is perceived as a quote unquote minor league at the time, and there were, but there have been other attempts with the name American Football League. I just got to throw that out there as a qualifier. There
was one, I believe, a couple of years later. I don't know much about it, but then of course there was the AFL that was organized by Lamar Hunt and some other very prominent men in 1960.
Right, that was number 4, the number 4 attempt, and the one you're referencing is actually the number 2 attempt, or was now agreed upon as being the AFL 2 from 36 to 37. Anyway, I digress, but it's an important point. But
it is.
Yeah. But it seems to me though that you had an owner in Goodman who, I guess, he became not only the flag bearer for the league but also for the team. He kind of gravitates more towards trying to organize this league from Memphis going forward, right, to the point where he helps basically launch the league in the following year, in 1934? Yes,
he did. I think he saw an opportunity because the NFL did see some growth. It was growing, and it was becoming popular. Mostly it was popular among the working class people who worked in those factories. They identified with these football players, the hard, rough game, and they enjoyed it. Al Capone, the big gangster, he loved professional football. And they were starting to get some stars. And it was also starting to be recognized by sports writers that just because you had been very good in college didn't necessarily mean you were going to make it in the NFL. A lot of college All-Americans came in the NFL, and they weren't as good as they had been in college. Professional football was starting to really develop as a sport in the early 30s. And Godman saw this, and he saw an opportunity for a Southern League. And most of the players that were on the rosters of these Southern teams were the discards of the NFL teams. Like they'd send some manager up to the North, and he'd sign players who had been cut by the the NFL teams, and they'd come down and play. There was a lineman with the Tigers named Champ Seabold, and he was a rookie from the University of Wisconsin, and he was a great big guy. He was like 6'4", and he weighed 235 pounds, which was an enormous man back then. And the Packers, I believe, deliberately sent him down to Memphis for a little seasoning. And when the season was over, he went back, he rejoined the Packers, and he was a star in the NFL during the 30s. And a lot of those players that played in the Southern American Football League, to give it a, to the distinction, they went on and they starred in the NFL in the following years. There was a quarterback for the team for the Kansas City. I can't quite think of his name right now. It might come to me, but he was a very talented player, and he went and played in the NFL in the 30s, and he was a star. And I think their status was, as you said, it was minor league in the hope of becoming major league. But there wasn't enough money. The country was still in the throes of the Depression, and the South didn't have the population and the manufacturing, and the middle class didn't have enough wealth in the middle class to support professional football or any other really major professional sport.
So describe then that it would seem to me that that 1934 would have been the best shot to challenge the NFL as a league, Memphis to be part of that challenger league. Maybe you want to describe sort of 1934, which frankly I think kind of was the ultimate demise of the team for good, despite the intentions.
Well, 1934, Tim, started off really good. The sports reporters in Memphis were excited about it. Like Early Maxwell wrote about it, and they had a player named Walter. They had a wonderful writer for the Commercial Appeal named Walter Stewart, and he was the sports editor for one of the newspapers, and he wrote well about them, and they were excited about it. And a lot of the teams had started off with some pretty good financial backing. Like there was a wealthy woman who owned the Dallas team. She was the daughter of an oil man, and her name was Glyma Orr. And the Memphis team moved from Hodges Field to the bigger stadium, Russwood, just a few blocks away, that had covered stands. And many of the politicians in Memphis, like E.H. Crump, who was the political boss there, he always attended Tiger games. The first few games, I think they got some good crowds. One of the problems back then in all of professional football was the crowd that they attracted on Sunday was weather dependent. If it was a rainy Sunday day, that would keep down attendance. And this was true even in the NFL, where you had these huge stadiums like Wrigley Field and Comiskey Park. If you had a rainy Sunday and the Bears were playing the Brooklyn Dodgers, you'd still get, and it was raining really hard, you were lucky if you got 5,000 people in that huge cavernous stadium. And it was even more so in the South. I mean, like, if you had a rainy Sunday, the game sale came on Sunday. They tried to sell, they had some season tickets available, and they sold a few of those, but most of your big sales came on the day of the game. And if it was a rainy day, people stayed inside. And rather than go to the ballpark, if they were interested, they'd listen to it on the radio. That hurt at the gate. Nowadays, they're playing in these big, huge covered stadiums. And one of the reasons they have these covered stadiums is so that, the rain's not going to affect attendance. And it was just, it was a magnificent effort, but it failed because of the Depression. And I guess really the South, I keep repeating this, but it's true, wasn't yet ready for major professional sports. When did they finally get a Major League Baseball team? When did that happen? I guess it was Atlanta or maybe Houston. the Astros. I'm not sure, but it wasn't really until the early 60s. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I think that's largely true. It's, again, I think, and we've explored some of this with baseball at the time too. I do think the long lasting effects of through the good part of the 1930s. I mean, the Depression certainly was something that was not just a stock market crash in '29, right? It had long standing, lingering effects, and it was in many respects almost a reset of the nation's economy. At the time in pro sports, was not the industrial complex that it is today. But it did seem, I guess, going into 1935, it did seem that there was going to be a second year of this league, minor league or attempted professional competitor league, debated. But it seemed like there were delays to get the league up and going for the second season, and it kind of collapsed upon itself. And therein taking the Tigers with them.
And the reason for it was because was money. There just wasn't enough money to make it go. They were losing money, and the people just didn't. They lost interest because of that. The people who would finance a team lost interest because of that. But a couple of the old players kept it going a little bit longer, and they played a couple of games in the fall of 1935. But again, attendance was, they were drawing just 1,000 people at the most, and that wasn't enough.
Well, as you did your work and your investigation, so it seems to me that was almost the I don't want to say the death knell, but it did put a damper on Memphis's opportunities and/or attempts to become a professional football town, and arguably something that still eludes the city today. But we've seen this again and again with other fledgling challenger professional football leagues. Memphis is always on that short list, probably alongside Birmingham, for consideration, right? And obviously the Memphis Tigers collegiate team has had pockets of success over the years and NFL players and all that. But do you think, because you've studied so much on this topic, do you think that, and I know this is revisionist, right? But do you think that if Memphis had somehow hung on, maybe less as an independent, but as either part of a challenger league or maybe had been part of the NFL and stuck around? I know this is sort of a bit assumptive, that perhaps it could be a different story, or do you think, to your point earlier, that Memphis just wasn't ready at the time and maybe it would not have worked?
Memphis was just not ready at the time. The real chance that they had was through Clarence Saunders. He was a very wealthy man, and you can tell that he loved that team, and he loved the sport. He loved the engagement of it. And he was a great promoter, too. He knew how to promote things. If he hadn't gone broke, he would have kept that team going. And he might have even made a success of them. He announced in the papers in 1929, Hallis invited him into the NFL unofficially. If he wanted to be in the NFL, he probably could have been, because they wanted wealthy, exuberant men like Clarence Saunders in the NFL. And in that day, he was a very famous man. He was a real mogul, but he was overextended in business. I think he had a lot of loans out. I'm not sure about this, but he got caught, with the Depression. And so he went broke. But had he not gone broke, had he had enough reserves, he was planning on building a big stadium in Memphis. He announced that in the papers. And he was going to play all his games at home. Again, it was more economic for a team to play at home because they were assured of a gate there and they didn't have travel expenses. And they could bring in a good team by paying them a guarantee. And him being the promotional genius that he was, who knows, maybe he could have drawn 20,000 people to each game and made a lot of money, But their real opportunity, when he lost his money, that was when the opportunity for the Memphis Tigers, that was their big demise. And I think that, in the South, you just didn't have the population and manufacturing and the wealth that a big manufacturers like they had in the North can give to the middle class. You didn't have that in the South so much as you did in the North.
Last question. What have you seen, if anything, from the university in Memphis or other teams or whatever in terms of their memory or deference or heritage link to the Tigers by the river, as you label the book, or have they largely still been forgotten and not, remembered?
Well, the head of the history department at the University of Memphis, he did an interview with me, and I'll send you that link, Tim. I'll send you that link. And he was quite thrilled that someone managed to dig all this up. The story behind the University of Memphis and the Memphis Tigers, in 1929, when the Tigers were really a very good and a thrill to watch, one of the men who refereed their games was a fellow named Zach Curlin. And the next year, in 1930, he was hired by what was then West Tennessee State Teachers College as the athletic director. And he decided to name the athletic teams after the Tigers because they had such a fine winning spirit about them, and they were the best professional football team in the nation in 1929. And he thought that, in honor of that spirit, of that winning drive, he wanted to name his college athletic teams after them. And now that college is the University of Memphis, and the athletic teams are still the Tigers. There is a street that runs through the University of Memphis on their eastern boundary called Zach Curlin Boulevard, named in honor of the original athletic director there. And most people have really forgotten that. They didn't realize that, the Memphis athletic teams, the Tigers, were named after the sole professional football team owned by a very wealthy man. So in the interview, the head of the history department, Dr. Aram, he brought that out in the interview, and he was delighted that some light had been cast upon this.
So there's an official link then of the Memphis Tigers of the old fledgling American Football League and prior to today's University of Memphis Tigers athletic program.
Yeah, and they're going to roar this year too, I hear.
Well, we shall see as college football season gets ready to gear up in the next couple of weeks. And look, Wylie, I got to thank you a bunch for taking a good hour or so to have a very interesting conversation. And I will tell you, we're not necessarily spending a whole lot of time in our little journey into forgotten teams and leagues and stuff in the, let's call them minor or other than full-fledged professional teams and entities. But this one struck me as being an interesting, proto perhaps, or primordial part of what is today's NFL, right? Because football did exist before the advent of the NFL, and certainly the NFL was not what it is today back in the 20s and 30s. And it's really important, I think, as even though Memphis didn't rise to the level of being an NFL franchise per se, the existence of this team and its role in professional football at that time, including some major games against top NFL teams, and its almost ability to become a full-fledged pro competitor team to that of the NFL. It's an interesting part of the overall fabric of pro football, and I think it's a really compelling one to consider. So I urge our listeners to seek out the book. It is called Tigers by the River: A True and Accurate Tale of the Early Years of Professional Football. It is published by Sunbury Press. It is available wherever, as they say, good books are found, and of course that'll be on our website as well for a one-click purchase opportunity. And I can't thank you enough for taking time to regale us with some of this, and hopefully a couple of books and rediscoveries are our
Been a lot of
partner.
fun, Tim. Been a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, and I look forward to keeping in touch, too.
Yeah, I do, too.
Go Tigers.
Yeah, all right. Go Tigers.
There's our chat with Wylie McLallen. Thank you, Wylie, for that interesting conversation. And again, I've taken some liberty here, as I'm wont to do on this show. It is my show for God's sakes. We tend to kind of focus on teams and leagues that were truly quote unquote professional, either as a challenger or as part of major leagues that were established at some point. There's no hard and fast rule to that. In this case, I made a great exception for it because I thought it was important, an interesting story as well. That certainly doesn't hurt. About the early days of the NFL, really, which was reflected in the story of these Memphis Tigers. Even though they never were in the NFL themselves, they never were in, I guess, what could be considered a major professional challenger league, although it being called the American Football League, the second use of that name in the history books, it's still important and overlapping with some of those early formative days of the NFL. Thus, a worthwhile chat and story to explore. So I thank our guest, Wylie McLallen, tremendously for being part of our little journey together in podcast land. The book he wrote is called Tigers by the River, a true and accurate tale of the early years of professional football. It is published by Sunbury Press. You can find it, as they say, wherever good books are found. And, of course, you can find a link to the purchase of said book and all its various forms on our beloved website. Of course, that's goodseatsstillavailable.com. Please indeed go check it out, and I think you'll enjoy a little bit of the stuff we have for you there, including all the past episodes and all that fun stuff. If you would be kind enough to also give us a follow on various forms of social media, that's a good way to stay connected with us, and we certainly love your love there. And that's on Twitter, you can find us at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you will find us at Good Seats Still Available. You will find a book, Facebook, that's what I'm trying to say, Facebook page devoted to the show, of course. And, of course, if you're downloading or recording or subscribing, please give us a review, rate us if you will as well. If that's on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, whatever the name of that is this week, that's a good place to do it. But anywhere else that you're able to review said show, we certainly love that as well. That helps the algorithm. It helps our popularity. We rise on various lists, all that good stuff. We have a lot more to come in the weeks following. We're probably going to get a Patreon page up and running. We've got some other goodies coming. We've got a newsletter coming up. And as well, of course, some great conversations and interviews. So please be on the lookout for that. And again, keep in contact with us and let us know how you're enjoying the show. We love hearing from the fans. We also love our friends at Podfly Productions, which we don't want to forget, down in Gadsden, Alabama. The guys down there do a great job in trying to make us as professional as possible, despite my attempts to not do so. And they know who they are, but you should know who they are as well. That's people like Jerry Payne and David Gregerson and Corey Coates and Eric McGay. Podfly Productions, if you're interested in your own podcast production help and support and professionalism, podfly.net is the place to go. Podfly, PODFLY.net. Visit there early and often and tell them your pal Tim Hanlon and Good Seats Still Available sent you. Okay, I'm done. You're done. We're all done. We'll see you next week. Take care.